The Hook. The story begins in media res, March 1945, near the Rhine River. Oberleutnant Hans Vogel pressed the field glasses so hard against his sockets he thought the metal might draw blood. Through the rain-slicked lens, from his hidden position in the hills east of the Rhine, he watched the American army assemble. It was impossible. Intelligence had insisted the U.S. 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were regrouping nearly 40 miles north, near Viersen. But Vogel's own eyes told him intelligence was wrong. Below him, in the pre-dawn gloom, was the unmistakable, terrifying signature of a massive armored buildup. He counted them: 1, 2, 20, 30 M4 Sherman tanks, their long cannons pointing menacingly toward the German line. He saw rows of 6x6 trucks, artillery pieces being unhitched, and hundreds of armed GIs moving with purpose. The low, guttural rumble of idling engines vibrated through the mud and into his bones. This wasn't a feint. This was an invasion force. He scrambled to his radio, his fingers numb. "Command, this is Observation Post 3B. The Americans are here. I repeat, the Americans are here. We are seeing elements of at least 2 divisions, armored, preparing for a river crossing. Send everything you have. Alles!" The response was frantic. Within hours, 2 full German Panzer divisions, desperate to protect the heartland, were rerouted, thundering south to crush the invasion force Vogel had spotted. But as the Panzers arrived, they found nothing. No tanks, no artillery, no divisions. Only mud, a few abandoned fields, and what was that? A soldier kicked something half-buried. It wasn't steel. It was rubber. It hissed. Hans Vogel had not reported an army. He had reported a performance, and the German High Command had just fallen for the greatest magic trick of the Second World War. Part 1. The Conjuring. Chapter 1. The Men from Nowhere. The idea was born not in a war room, but in a New York advertising agency and a London film studio. It was 1943, and the war was being fought on a scale humanity had never imagined. But victory, the Allies knew, wouldn't just be about brute force. It would be about deception. The man tasked with turning this fantasy into a weapon was Colonel Harry L. Reeder, a stoic, imaginative officer who understood that the next great weapon wasn't a bomb. It was a story. He needed a unit unlike any other. So he didn't recruit from West Point. He recruited from Pratt Institute, the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, and the ringing halls of the Art Students League of New York City. He recruited painters, architects, set designers, sound engineers, actors, and advertising men. He found men who had spent their lives creating illusions, making cardboard look like marble, making a 10-foot stage look like the Roman Forum. He recruited Bill Blass, a young man with impeccable eye for style, who, before the war, sketched fashion. Now he would be sketching camouflage. There was Ellsworth Kelly, a future abstract painter, who would design posters and visual decoys. There was Art Kane, a future photography legend, and George Diestel, a former set designer for Radio City Hall. They were gathered at Camp Forest, Tennessee, under a bland, forgettable name, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. They were 1,100 men. Their mission was to impersonate other much larger U.S. Army units. Their job was to be 30,000 men. They were given no real weapons to fight with. Instead, they were given a toolkit for the surreal. First, there was the Visual Deception Unit, the 603 Camouflage Engineers. Their primary weapon was not the M4 Sherman tank, but the inflatable M4 Sherman tank. Made from vulcanized rubber and weighing only 93 pounds, a team of 4 men could build an entire tank column in under 30 minutes. They had inflatable artillery, inflatable jeeps, and inflatable trucks. From 500 yards away or from the cockpit of a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. Second, there was sonic deception, the 3132 Signal Service Company. War had a sound. It wasn't just booms. It was the specific, identifiable clatter of the 9th Armored Division's tank treads on cobblestone, or the unique cadence of the 2nd Division's radio operators. Led by engineers from Bell Labs, this unit traveled with massive 500-pound speakers mounted on half-tracks. They possessed a library of classified wire recordings captured at great risk near the front lines. They could play the sound of an entire division digging in, or an armored column arriving by night, and broadcast it for 15 miles. They learned to mix the sound, a jeep driving past, soldiers shouting, the clank of a wrench on metal, to create a perfect, terrifying audio illusion. Finally, there was atmospherics, the special effects. This was pure theater. Men from the 23rd would drive a single jeep in a loop for hours, with 2 soldiers in the back changing their shoulder patches every few miles to make a few men look like an endless convoy. They would roll into French towns near the fake front line, deliberately dressed in the uniforms and insignia of the division they were impersonating. They'd go to cafes, order wine, and talk loudly, loud enough for known local collaborators to overhear, about their big push planned for the next morning. This was the Ghost Army. They were given a simple, impossible task. Go to France, lie to the German High Command, and don't get killed. They landed in Normandy just weeks after D-Day, their rubber tanks packed in crates, their speakers ready. Their first missions were small, plugging holes in the line, drawing fire away from exhausted units. But their masterpiece, the performance that would save thousands of lives, was yet to come. It would be their final act, the crossing of the Rhine. Part 2. The Phantom Front. Chapter 2. A Symphony of Lies. They arrived in France in fragments, landing on Utah Beach in late August 1944. The air still smelled of salt and diesel. The real war, the one of steel and blood, had already moved inland, chasing the Germans across the country in a furious breakout. The 23rd was sent to follow the chaos, like a shadow trailing the fist. Their first major test was near the ancient and battled city of Brest. The U.S. 6th Armored Division was secretly pulling out of the line to redeploy, leaving a 15-mile gap. A gap that, if discovered, the Germans would pour through like water through a broken dam. This mission fell to Sergeant Jack Hollywood Malone, a man who, a year prior, was designing window displays for Saks Fifth Avenue. He was thin, perpetually annoyed, and believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing with style. "All right, you Picassos," Malone barked at his crew from the 603, the rain dripping from his helmet. "This isn't Tennessee. This is the show. We are opening tonight." Their stage was a series of muddy fields and hedgerows. Their audience was the 2nd Paratrooper Division, battle-hardened veterans who were listening and watching from just a few miles away. Malone's actors arrived flat, in wooden crates. With a hiss, the air compressors kicked in, and the Army was born. One by one, M4 Shermans, M10 tank destroyers, and 155mm Long Tom artillery pieces rose from the mud. They weren't just tanks, they were sculptures. Each 93-pound balloon was a perfect replica, down to the serial numbers and the subtle sheen of gun oil, which Malone's men painstakingly applied by hand. "Laziness gets you killed," Malone yelled, kicking a private who had pointed a rubber cannon directly at the sky. "What is this, an anti-aircraft gun? Angle it. It needs motivation. It's covering that crossroad. Look menacing, for God's sake." He had his men drive a single-reel tank back and forth across the field all night, carving hundreds of deep, convincing tracks in the mud. Then he parked the real tank in the woods and placed a dozen inflatable ones in the tracks it had left. The visual illusion was only Act 1. Act 2 began from a half-track hidden in a collapsed barn 2 miles away. Inside, Corporal Abe Ears Rabinovich was preparing his masterpiece. Abe was the opposite of Malone.
He was a quiet, meticulous audio engineer from Bell Labs. He didn't see art. He saw physics. "Wind is 5 miles per hour, west-northwest," he whispered to his assistant, checking his calculations. "Atmospheric pressure is dropping. The sound will travel cleaner. It'll sound closer." He queued up his recordings. His orchestra was a series of wire recordings captured from the real 6th Armored. He slipped on his headphones, his eyes closed like a maestro. From the 500-pound speakers mounted on the truck, a sound erupted that shook the leaves from the trees. It wasn't just noise, it was a narrative. It was the sound of an army arriving. The metallic clank and squeal of tank treads, the thud of ammo crates being dropped, the distant shouting of a sergeant. The recording was titled "Sergeant Nasty, Supply," and the unmistakable low rumble of dozens of engines idling. Abe mixed the sounds live. He added a track of 2 soldiers arguing, then a track of a wrench dropping on steel. He was creating a 3-dimensional illusion of an army settling in for the night. The Germans on the other side of the valley listened. Their radio operators heard it. Their forward observers heard it, and they reported it. The 6th Armored was still there. The third act was the most dangerous. It belonged to the atmospherics team, the 406th Combat Engineers. These were the method actors. 2 lieutenants, wearing the precise shoulder patches of the 6th Armored, drove a jeep into the nearby shattered town of Plebenec. They parked in the square, walked into a half-destroyed boulangerie that was miraculously still open, and ordered 2 café au lait. They spoke English loudly. "I don't care what the captain says, we're not ready to push on Brest. The 101st is supposed to relieve us, but we're the ones stuck here." They argued over a map, drank their coffee, and left. Within 3 hours, German intelligence had 3 corroborating reports. Eyes, aerial recon. Armored division spotted in Sector 4B, dug in, fuel and ammo dumps visible. Malone's rubber tanks. Ears, signal intercept. Heavy mechanized presence confirmed. Audio signature matches 6th Armored. Abe's loudspeakers. Human intelligence. 2 lieutenants from 6th Armored confirmed in Plebenec. Morale is low. They are complaining about being held in the line. The actors from the 406th. The German commander, convinced the 6th Armored was static, kept his forces in place. He aimed his artillery not at the real 6th Armored, which was at that moment driving 70 miles north, but at the coordinates of Abe Rabinovich's phantom engine sounds. That night, the 23rd took their first barrage. Abe and his sound engineer were inside their half-track when the first screaming meanie, a German Nebelwerfer rocket, hit. The world dissolved in fire and sound. The explosion was 300 yards away, but the shock wave threw Abe against the radio bank. "They're shooting at us," his assistant screamed, grabbing his helmet. "They're shooting at the noise." "Of course they are," Abe yelled back, his hand shaking so badly he could barely grip the dials. "It's working. Give me tank maintenance. Louder. Make them think they missed." He cranked the volume. As real German shells rained down on their fake position, Abe Rabinovich fought back with the only weapon he had. the recorded sound of a man fixing a Jeep. They sat there for an hour, broadcasting their lies, as real high-explosive shells walked a line across the empty field, obliterating patches of mud and at one point vaporizing an inflatable Jeep. When the shelling stopped, there was a profound silence. Jack Malone emerged from his foxhole covered in mud. He walked over to one of his rubber Shermans. It had taken a direct hit from a piece of shrapnel. It was deflating, slowly, with a pathetic hiss. He patched it with a standard-issue tire kit. The 6th Armored Division moved north without a single casualty, their movement completely masked. The Ghost Army had held the line. They had repelled a potential German counterattack with rubber, speakers, and 2 cups of coffee. The War of Illusion had begun. But their next mission would require them to not just hold the line, but to create a ghost offensive so real it would fool an entire army. Their performance at Brest was an off-Broadway tryout. The Rhine would be their opening night. Part 3. When the Ghosts Bled. Chapter 3. The Coldest Magic. The winter of 1944 was the coldest in memory. The war, which had seemed so close to an end after the liberation of Paris, had stalled. The Ghost Army found itself in the dense, snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, a region considered a quiet sector, a place for exhausted divisions to rest. For the 23rd, it was a time of frustrating maintenance. Rubber tanks cracked in the freezing cold, speaker wire stiffened and snapped. Their deceptions were small-scale, mostly spoof radio, to make the quiet sector seem slightly more active than it was. On the night of December 16th, Corporal Abe Ears Robinovich was shivering in his sound truck near Luxembourg City, trying to repair a phonograph needle. He was listening on his headphones, not to his own recordings, but to the ambient noise of the front. Suddenly, a new sound filled his ears. It started as a low seismic vibration. "Hey, Malone," he called over the intercom to Jack Malone, who was in a nearby foxhole trying to thaw a can of sea rations. "Are you kidding me? It's 2 in the morning. Even the ghosts are asleep." "Then we have a problem," Abe said, his voice dropping, "because I'm listening to about 200 engines, and, God, they're not ours." It was the sound of the Wacht am Rhein, the Germans' desperate, massive counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The sound Abe heard was the vanguard of the 5th Panzer Army punching a hole through the American lines just north of them. Within hours, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were in a position they had never trained for, never wanted, and were uniquely unequipped to handle. A real fight. The American front hadn't just bent, it had shattered. A panicked and retreating 4th Infantry Division fell back through the 23rd's position. The Ghost Army, with its 1,100 artists and engineers, was suddenly the front line. "Inflate everything," a major screamed, his face pale in the light of a burning Jeep. "Sir, they're not 5 miles out. They're here. They're not going to be fooled by a balloon," Malone yelled back. A German 88mm shell screamed overhead and exploded in the trees behind them. The illusion was gone. This was real. Colonel Reeder, the 23rd's commander, got the order from a frantic General Middleton, "You are the only thing between the Germans and Luxembourg City. You will hold that crossroads. Hold it until you are relieved. That is all." "Hold it with what?" Malone muttered, dragging an ammo box. This was the moment the actors were forced off the stage and into the audience, which was now shooting at them. Abe Robinovich and his sound crew had a different idea. They couldn't fake an army, so they would become one. They unbolted their massive 500-pound speakers. They didn't point them at the Germans, they pointed them at their own men, along their half-mile-long defensive line of foxholes. "What are you doing, Abe?" Malone shouted, dragging an ammo box. "Morale," Abe shouted back, his hands shaking as he cued a recording.
As the first wave of Panzer Grenadiers advanced, ghostly white figures against the snow, Abe didn't play the sound of tanks. He played the sound of the 101st Airborne's artillery, a recording he had from Normandy, at full, deafening volume. Boom, whoosh, crack. The sound echoed through the frozen valley. The Americans of the 23rd, huddled in their holes, heard it and cheered, thinking reinforcements had arrived. The Germans, already jittery and advancing, heard it and paused, thinking they were walking into a prepared kill box. It bought the 23rd 10 minutes. But the Germans came on. A real German Panther tank, not a recording, lumbered into view. Its machine gun opened up, stitching a line of fire across the 23rd's position. Men who had spent the war painting watercolors and mixing sound effects were now firing .50 caliber machine guns from the backs of their half-tracks, their primary defense. "Get the sound truck out of here," Malone screamed at Abe. The truck, with its sensitive audio equipment, was the unit's brain. "Not yet." Abe saw the Panther stop, looking for targets. He switched his audio track. It was a gamble, an insane, artistic, desperate gamble. He cued the recording of an American M10 tank destroyer, which had a very distinct, high-velocity crack. He played it at maximum volume. Crack! The sound of the non-existent tank destroyer echoed from a speaker 300 yards to the left. The Panther's turret instinctively swiveled toward the sound, searching for the threat. It fired its main gun, a flash of orange that vaporized a snowbank and the speaker that had made the noise. But in that 3-second distraction, a real American bazooka team from the 406th crawled into position. They fired. The rocket hit the Panther's rear deck, disabling it. The 23rd held the crossroads for 2 days. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were terrified. They were outgunned. But they used what they knew. They used sound as a weapon, camouflage to hide their machine gun nests, and pure, raw nerve to keep the Germans at bay. When the real 10th Armored Division finally arrived to relieve them, its commander was stunned. "Who the hell are you?" "We're the 23rd headquarters, sir." "The 23rd? You're a special troops battalion. You held off a Panzer regiment with... What do you even have?" Malone just pointed to a smoking speaker, a deflated decoy tank riddled with real bullet holes, and the exhausted artists holding rifles. They had casualties. They had men killed in action. The Ghost Army had bled. As they pulled back from the line, the men were silent. The war was no longer a game. They had seen the enemy's face, and they had seen their own friends fall. This experience forged them into something new. They weren't just artists playing soldier anymore. They were veterans. And they now understood in their bones what their deceptions truly meant. Every German division they could fool, every Panzer they could send on a wild goose chase, was one less division that real men in real tanks would have to fight. They were ready for their final performance. They were ready for the Rhine. Part 4. The Masterpiece. Chapter 4. The 40-Mile Lie. In March 1945, the Allied war machine stood at the banks of the Rhine, the last great natural barrier protecting the German heartland. The strategic plan was codenamed Operation Flashpoint. The U.S. Ninth Army would cross the river near Wesel. General Eisenhower and his command knew the German defense, led by the fanatical 1st Parachute Army and veteran Panzer divisions, would be ferocious. The cost of a direct, opposed river crossing was estimated to 20,000 to 30,000 Allied casualties. A bloodbath. Unless, of course, the German army wasn't looking at Wesel. On March 10th, in a damp, candlelit barn south of the Dutch border, Colonel Reeder unrolled a map for his officers. The men, Malone, Abe, and the other unit leaders, were no longer the eager art students from Camp Forest. They were gaunt, quiet, and hardened by the ice of the Ardennes. "Gentlemen," Reeder said, his voice low, General Simpson is crossing the 9th Army here. He tapped Wesel. We are going to make the Germans believe the crossing is here. His finger landed 25 miles south, near the city of Viersen. We are not holding a gap, Reeder continued, looking each man in the eye. We are not plugging a hole. We are creating an entire phantom army group. You will impersonate 2 full divisions, the 30th and the 79th Infantry. That's 30,000 men. You will have 7 days to build them, make them arrive, and prepare them for a river crossing that will never happen. Our mission, Reeder concluded, is to draw every Panzer, every 88, and every pair of German eyes south. We are the bait. This operation is codenamed Viersen. It will be our masterpiece or our funeral. Jack Hollywood Malone, who had patched bullet holes in his rubber tanks, now had to deploy over 600 of them. This wasn't just scattering decoys, it was choreographing an invasion. "This is set dressing on a biblical scale," Malone muttered to his sergeants. His teams moved only at night, in total radio silence. They didn't just inflate tanks, they created evidence. They dug massive, shallow pits with bulldozers, then parked 50 rubber Shermans in them, creating a perfect camouflaged tank park. They built fake headquarters, complete with radio antennae that broadcast nothing but static. They strung lines of laundry between rubber trucks. They used bulldozers to carve fake roads, then drove a single jeep up and down them for 24 hours until they looked like heavily trafficked supply routes. Malone's masterpiece was the dummy airfield. In a single night, his men laid out a half-mile of metal tracking and parked a squadron of inflatable P-51 Mustang fighters on it. From the air, it was an irresistible target. While Malone built the body, Abe gave it a voice.
This was Abe's symphony. For 72 hours, he broadcast the sound of an army arriving. First, the spoof radio operators filled the airwaves with the coded chatter of the 30th and 79th Divisions, perfectly mimicking their radio signatures. Then, Abe's speakers kicked in. He didn't just play tank noises, he played a narrative. Day 1, night. The sound of armored columns arriving, a low, distant rumble that grew for hours. Day 2, day. The sound of settling in, hammers, shovels, men shouting orders, jeep engines starting and stopping. Day 3, night. The sound of preparation, artillery calibration, tank engines revving, the sound of maintenance, and the clank of ammo boxes. But the most critical illusion was the one that would sell the lie, the crossing itself. "They're not going to believe we're crossing without bridges," Abe told his team. He had spent 2 days on the Meuse River, 50 miles back, recording a real U.S. engineering battalion practicing the construction of pontoon bridges. On the night of March 20th, Abe drove his sound truck right to the edge of the Rhine. Across the dark, swirling water, he could see the silhouette of the German defenses. He took a deep breath and played the recording. From the speakers, the sounds of industry erupted into the night, the chug-chug-chug of outboard motors, the splash of pontoons hitting the water, the bang of steel hammers on steel plates, and the shouted, muffled commands of engineers. Across the river, the Germans listened. This brings us back to Oberlieutenant Hans Vogel in his observation post on Hill 3B. For 48 hours, his superiors had dismissed his reports as Allied probing, but now he had visual and audio. Through his field glasses, he saw what Malone had built for him. 30 inflatable M4 tanks parked in a forward assembly area, their rubber cannons glinting in the pre-dawn light. From the valley below, he heard what Abe was playing for him, the gut-churning rumble of an armored division idling, waiting for the order to attack. He made the frantic radio call. The effect
was instantaneous. In the 23rd's hidden command post, a radio intercept operator, his headphones pressed tight, began to scribble. "Sir, I've got it. German 7th Army. They're talking about an imminent attack at Viersen. My God, they're rerouting the 116th Panzer Division and elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier. They're coming right for us." A quiet cheer went up in the tent. They had done it. They had fooled the entire German High Command. Then a new order came down from 9th Army headquarters. The real crossing at Wessel was set for 48 hours from now. Colonel Reedov looked at his men. The joy on their faces faded, replaced by the grim understanding from the Bulge. "They're coming for us," Reeder said. "Our job was to get their attention. Our new job is to hold it. We are not to retreat. We are not to go silent. We are to look like an army that is about to attack, and we are to take the punch that is meant for the 9th Army." Abe Rabinowitz and Jack Malone looked at each other. They had built the world's most elaborate stage, and now they were tied to it. "Well, Abe," Malone said, lighting a cigarette with a trembling hand, "let's give them an overture." Abe nodded. He went to his sound truck. He pulled out his most terrifying recording, one he had never used. It was labeled "Massed Artillery Barrage Incoming." He pointed his speakers not at the Germans, but toward his own lines, and waited. The real German shells began to fall 20 minutes later. The Ghost Army was now tasked with absorbing the full, undivided fury of 2 Panzer divisions they had summoned themselves. Their grandest illusion had just become their most dangerous trap. Part 5. The Crucible of Deception. Chapter 5. Holding the Line with Hot Air. The German counter-barrage was not a measured response. It was a spasm of calculated rage. Within 30 minutes of the coded message confirming the Panzers were rerouted to Viersen, the sky over the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops exploded. Hundreds of shells from 88mm batteries and heavy howitzers rained down on the fields, roads, and woods that Malone and Abe had spent a week preparing. Abe Rabinowitz, huddled inside his sound truck, felt the concussive force of the explosions trying to tear his eardrums. He was no longer playing a symphony of lives. He was fighting a duel with an entire German artillery corps, and his only weapon was a volume knob. "They're zeroing in on the HQ!" his assistant screamed, pointing to a plume of black smoke where a cluster of inflatable jeeps had been parked. Abe adjusted his headset. He had to convince the Germans not only that the army was still there, but that it was unfazed and fighting back. He slammed the lever on the largest recording he had. U.S. artillery firing, 155mm long toms. Boom! Crack! Whistle! The sounds of heavy American counter-battery fire, recorded months ago at a training ground in England, blared from the speakers. It was a raw, physical noise. Abe's truck shook as if the real guns were mounted directly on the roof. By broadcasting the sound of immediate heavy return fire, he hoped to convince the German spotters that they hadn't hit an easy target, but a deeply dug-in, organized enemy. Outside, Sergeant Jack Malone was living a nightmare invented by Salvador Dali. A shell had landed squarely on the inflatable tank park. Rubber was melting, shrapnel was flying, and the illusion was deteriorating rapidly. "Section 3, get that decoy fuel dump smoking," Malone yelled, ducking into a shell crater. His men didn't have real fuel. They had barrels of diesel mixed with rags, which created thick, oily black smoke, the unmistakable sign of an armored division taking losses, but still present. Malone grabbed a crew and dashed across a field pocked with shell holes. A real American truck, hit moments before, was burning fiercely. "Quickly, get the rubber out! Bring the scorched M10! They tossed the remains of the melted inflatable decoys into the crater. And in their place, they dragged a huge piece of camouflage netting over one of their burnt-out, half-melted M10 tank destroyer props. Malone didn't want the Germans to think they were retreating. He wanted them to think they were fighting until the last man. The illusion had to look like a desperate, bloody reality. The danger intensified when German forward patrols, emboldened by the artillery fire, began to probe the lines to confirm the destruction. These were Panzer grenadiers, veterans who would not be fooled by just noise. The men of the 23rd, the artists, actors, and engineers, dropped their props and grabbed their rifles. The lesson from the Bulge was sharp and clear. If the enemy got close enough to touch the rubber, the illusion was over, and the entire 9th Army's crossing would be compromised. They fired the few real weapons they had, a handful of machine guns at the encroaching shadows, making sure to fire bursts from widely separated positions. They weren't aiming for a tactical victory. They were aiming for a statistical lie. When the German patrols retreated, they reported confusion. Heavy, sporadic machine gun fire from at least 24 locations. Return fire is heavy, but their lines are holding. They are taking horrendous losses, but the assault appears imminent. That was the key. Horrendous losses, but the assault continues. For 48 hours, the 23rd was subjected to the full weight of the German counterattack, intended for 30,000 men. They huddled in trenches, patching rubber, changing tapes, and mimicking the radio traffic of 2 full divisions, all while shells detonated their inflatable world around them. Casualties were inevitable, but minimized by the fact that the Germans were shelling air, not men. Finally, just before dawn on March 24th, Colonel Reeder received the coded message he had waited for. Flashpoint complete. 9th Army successfully across the Rhine. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of death, it was the silence of success. Malone emerged from his hole. Abe powered down his sound truck. The 1,100 men of the 23rd had accomplished the impossible. They had saved thousands of American lives by taking the German army's wrath upon themselves, a wrath they had conjured from air, sound waves, and rubber cement. Their final act was the hardest. They couldn't leave their handiwork. On the morning of March 24th, while the 9th Army was establishing its beachhead 25 miles north, the Ghost Army methodically deflated itself. Inflatable tanks collapsed with a whoosh. Speakers were packed away, fake headquarters were leveled, and the rubber planes were rolled up and stacked. They loaded their equipment onto their trucks and silently drove away, leaving behind fields that were empty, save for the muddy tracks, shell craters, and the scorched remains of their props. The German High Command, still convinced the 30th and 79th Divisions were preparing a hopeless attack at Viersen, kept their vital Panzer reserves pinned there for days. By the time they realized the army was gone, the real crossing was complete, and the war was effectively over. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops vanished as quickly and quietly as they had arrived. Their battlefield was clean, their secrets secure. The greatest deception of the war would be immediately classified, hidden behind a veil of military silence for over 50 years. The men who had fought the war with paint, rubber, and sound were ordered never to speak of what they had done. Part 6. The Silence and the Legacy. Chapter 6. The Unsung Heroes. The war ended 2 months later. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were officially disbanded in Kassel, Germany, on June 29, 1945. There was no parade. There were no medals for the majority of the men. Their service records simply listed them as belonging to a Special Troops Battalion, a forgettable administrative unit. The men went home. They shed their anonymous olive-drab uniforms and stepped back into a world that had no idea of their unique heroism. They were bound by the highest level of military secrecy. To speak of the Ghost Army was to commit treason. Jack Malone, the architect of illusion, returned to New York and never spoke of the Rhine. Instead, he channeled his meticulous eye for visual reality into his post-war career, eventually becoming a renowned industrial designer. The fact that his rubber creations had drawn real German fire remained a secret shared only with the nightmares that sometimes visited him in the night. Abe Rabinowitz, the master of sound, went back to Bell Labs. He was the man who fought tanks with wire recordings. For decades, he heard the faint echo of German shells and American engines in the silence. He spent his life working on communication technology, often wondering if the greatest technological achievement of his career was the recording of a simple hammer hitting a pontoon bridge. Many of the men who had served in the 23rd went on to define post-war American culture. They became the creative force behind the next generation. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the most significant abstract painters of the 20th century. Bill Blass became a fashion icon, his eye for style honed by the necessity of perfect camouflage. Art Kane became a revolutionary photographer, famous for his iconic image, A Great Day in Harlem. They fought the war with art, and they used that experience to shape the piece. They became legends in their civilian fields, carrying the knowledge that their true, shared accomplishment, saving 15,000 to 30,000 lives by waging a war of the mind, remained classified in a file cabinet in the Pentagon. For 50 years, the story of the Ghost Army remained locked away. The men lived, aged, and died, knowing they had won a secret war that history refused to acknowledge. It wasn't until 1996 that the Pentagon finally declassified the records of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The few surviving veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, were finally allowed to tell their stories. The incredible truth of the rubber tanks, the sound trucks, and the actors who faced down Panzer divisions finally entered the historical record. They were heroes who used imagination as their artillery, art as their armor, and secrecy as their metal. They proved that in the grand theater of modern warfare, the mind could be the most powerful weapon of all. The final word on the Ghost Army belongs to the men they saved, the men of the 9th Army who crossed the Rhine in silence. They never knew they owed their lives to a platoon of artists who made a symphony of lies their last line of defense.